Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some ideas relating to intermediate moves, also about technique and some other interesting ideas. Here we go with our first position. This is from a real game between the legendary Viktor Korchnoi and the former Soviet Grandmaster Taitlin. In this position, it is White's turn, and Black has actually an extra pawn. However, White is able to take advantage of the circumstances. On one hand, that the Black Queen on d6 is on an unprotected square, and also the other one being that the Black Rooks and King stand in an unfortunate position. If you can imagine a White Knight appearing on f6, that would result a nice fork both on the Black King and both Rooks. Okay, well, let's think about the situation here. What should White do to actually gain some material advantage right away? I suggest you pause the video for a moment and try to figure out the correct continuation in this position for White. Well, I would look for a way to get the knight to f6. There aren't too many ways to get there, as White already has a pawn on d5, so that's not a possible route at the moment. On the other hand, the White knight is able to go to h5. At first it seems that of course could be captured by the Black pawn from g6. However, in reality it is not the case, as the Black Queen would be hanging on d6 then. Well, but what about if Black right now trades queens on g3 first? Now, when White recaptures on g3, if it's with the rook or the pawn, then White would just lose the knight on h5, and if the knight captures back, then there is no longer any threat on f6 to fork. However, here comes the tricky part, namely that the White knight can make an intermediate move, give a check with knight to f6, forcing the Black King to move out and only then to recapture Black's queen. And that's exactly what has happened in the game. Black moved the king to g7. Now, this is an interesting moment. White has the option to immediately capture Black's rook on e8 with a check. However, there is no rush. And this is an interesting and instructive moment, because oftentimes in such situation, when the other side doesn't have a way to get out of the fork, it is actually more beneficial to delay it, waiting until one of the rooks would move, trying to get out of the fork, and only then to capture the other rook. So therefore, Black would lose time. Let's see how that got demonstrated in the game. White captured, h takes g3, and now, for example, if Black would move one of the rooks out of danger's way, then knight takes rook, and the second rook would have to waste time and move a second time in a row and recapture. Let's go back to the game and see the technical part on how Korchnoi actually won the game. Came knight to b7, trying to get the knight to d6 to attack the c4 pawn. And now, before that would happen, White hurried up and already indeed took one of the rooks, forcing the Black rook to recapture and to make sure White grabs that e3 pawn before Black would succeed to defend it with the knight as well. What do we see right now? White is an exchange up, and there are even number of pawns. However, Black could potentially have some counterplay if they would have a bit more time, which they don't have. Black traded on e3, and the rook took back. And the problem really is that the white rook is so active that it's immediately threatening to move in to e7 to fork. And even if it wouldn't be quite a fork, it would attack black's pieces on the 7th rank. And that is where white has a winning advantage. The game continued by black playing king to f7, preventing the rook entry to the 7th rank. And now white played a4. Black, as expected, played knight to d6, going after white's pawn on c4. And this is an interesting moment where white rather gave the pawn up and decided to activate the king. Playing rook c3, protecting the pawn, would be very passive and allowing the black king to get activated through f6 and e5. White just played king f2 and continued knight takes pawn, sacrificing the pawn. Rook to e4, a very important move, attacking black's knight. The black knight better stays around, holding off white's d5 pawn. And rook to e6, attacking the knight again. Knight retreated to e8. I think to prevent a potential rook maneuver of moving the rook to c6 and then c7, black already is controlling the c7 square. And came king to f3. If black would right now advance the c5 pawn to c4, white would go behind the pawn immediately with the rook and win that pawn. So that wouldn't advance any of black's plans here. Black retreated with a knight to f6, attacking the pawn on d5. Came rook e5. Now the pawn is threatening to advance to d6. Therefore, the knight went back again to e8, trying to hold it off. And of course, white is not ready to repeat moves and agree to a draw. But it's time to advance the king. King f4. And now black is almost in a zugzwang situation, in that if the black knight moves to any place other than d6, the white pawn is ready to advance. If any of the pawn moves, that would weaken black's position and allow the entry to black's position. For example, after c4, the white rook could go behind that pawn through e6 and c6 and attack the pawn. If black would move the a7 pawn, that would weaken the b6 pawn, which could be attacked, and so on. Black proceeded by playing g5. King went back to f3. Knight d6. And rook e6, attacking the knight, as well as the pawn on h6. Knight c4 came, and the king finally can move forward to support the d-pawn. Knight d2, king e5, knight c4 check again, king f5, and now black has no more checks. And therefore, now the rook is protected on e6, the d-pawn can advance. Knight c6, and rook took on h6, and black resigned in this hopeless position. A very nice tactic in the beginning, and nice technique at the end. Let's move on to our second example that starts right from this position. This is a pretty closed type of position where white has space advantage. You also may notice that white has not castled yet in this position. However, the fact that the position is so closed, especially the center files, where potentially white's king could get into trouble, it makes it not so important. Also, you can notice that white has played a bit unusual by playing early on h4 and h5 with his pawn. trying to weaken the light squares in black's position. However, in this particular position, the subject is tactics. And white has a nice opportunity in this critical position to immediately gain material advantage. Again, I suggest you try to pause the recording for a moment and try to figure out the correct sequence for white right here. And white continued by playing c5. A pretty nice move, creating a fork immediately on black's queen and pawn on d6. The beauty is, if black captures this pawn with the d6 pawn, then white is ready to advance already the d pawn and create a fork on black's rook and knight. The problem is that if the black queen moves away to some random square other than capturing the pawn, of course, then the white pawn is ready to appear on d6 and again fork. In the game, black continued by queen capturing the pawn. The problem now is, though, that black stabbed into a discovery. And indeed, white continued with knight captures pawn. Now, the black queen is under attack from the rook, and so is the black rook from white's knight on b5. If right now the black queen retreats to b6, white would simply capture the rook on c7 and win an exchange. Black instead chose to rather give up the queen for a rook and to win white's knight in addition. However, objectively speaking, black's position is pretty hopeless at this stage. White recaptured, pawn captured the knight, and pawn captured on c6. If right now black would recapture the pawn with the rook, white's plan was to play queen a3. Black instead captured with the knight, and white captured bishop takes pawn. And now the black knight is also in an uncomfortable pin. Black captured knight e4 in hopes that if now bishop takes knight, then black would double the rooks, pinning the bishop and winning it back. But white can do a bit better, playing bishop a5 first, still using that same pin. Rook cc8, bishop took, and of course black didn't quite blunder. A tricky move, knight c5. Look at that. All of a sudden the black knight is threatening to fork with knight to d3. Also, the white bishop cannot run away, not even to a square which would guard the d3 square, because, for example, if right now white would play bishop b5, that would be a blunder, because knight d3 would arrive with a discovery. Let's go back again. In view of black's threat of playing knight to d3 to fork, or as I explained, if the white bishop would move, it would be still a good move, creating a discovery. White has castled in this position. And black got the opportunity to capture the bishop on c6. However, now some tricky sequence is following, creating a pin over the black knight, but black is tricky just as well and plays rook to a6. So now if pawn takes knight, then rook takes bishop, and black is still hanging in there. But white has another tricky move, playing queen to c4. And black protected the rook another time to rescue the knight. Came queen b5, knight e6, and it's time to bring another piece to the action, rook c1, with the idea to next play a move we shall see after knight e4, rook c8, check. Rook takes, and queen takes a6. Luckily, the h-pawn is not on h2 anymore, so white has a little window to exit with the king. Rook c2, and now time to advance the b-pawn. Came king h7, bishop b6, rook f2. White makes sure gets rid of that knight that could potentially be source of danger, and the b pawn is advancing. Bishop b5, king g1, attacking the rook, and the b pawn advances. d5, opening up the diagonal of the bishop to control the b8 square. Game queen f1, threatening to fork on f5. The black king moved out, but it doesn't quite help the situation because after queen e1, the rook and the bishop is hanging, and then black would protect the rook, but it could still capture it because of the b pawn about to get promoted. Okay, let's move on to our next example. And here it is. This is a very fascinating position where white has a clear attack. However, it seems at the moment that the knight is hanging on h6 and white must retreat, and also that there aren't that many pieces left on the board. However, yet, white does not need to retreat. White needs to be aggressive and follow up on the attack. It's a great example to try to exercise in trying to play out with one of your friends or maybe your computer. White proceeded by playing rook to f3, bringing an important piece to the attack to the g file. First of all, let's examine what would happen if right now black would just indeed capture that knight. Well, the idea then is to move quietly the rook to g3, not allowing the black king to retreat to safety through g7 to h8. For example, if the black queen would try to play queen d4 right now, white would checkmate black real quick by forcing the king to get out even further, and with a few well-placed checks, the game will end with checkmate real soon. And king g5, and voila, here we go. Very nice checkmate. Let's go back. Black in the actual game did not capture the knight on h6, although let's go back to that variation for a moment. What would happen after king h6, rook g3, if black would decide to give the knight back? Well, what would happen then is white would simply capture that knight. And even though the king can try to run back, it will not find full safety because pawn would take with a discovered check. Naturally now the king cannot capture the white pawn because that would allow checkmate immediately with queen h5, so the king needs to try to hide behind white's pawn with king h8, and now white would play aggressively, not giving black the time to safely win that pawn back on h7 and play queen g4. Now the threat is obvious, checkmating on g7. And for example, after queen f8, that protects against that, white would play queen h5 right away, threatening with rook g8, keeping black busy, queen e7, and now inching up to g6 with the threat of playing queen g8, sacrificing the queen, and then to checkmate. And when now queen moves back to f8, now amazingly white can break through using the fact that both of the black queen and rook is in need in remaining on the 8th rank to guard the g8 square. So therefore white can safely sacrifice a pawn or two, and the e-pawn the rook cannot capture because of queen g8, and when pawn takes, then f6, d3, and f7, and at the end of the day the queen will arrive to g8 with checkmate in a few additional moves. So let's go back to the actual game, where in this position after rook f3, black continued by playing knight to d7. White continues the same way, rook g3, provoking the black king to capture the knight. If black would choose not to capture, for example, move to the corner, then white would checkmate immediately with knight f7. Or, if the king would choose to move the other direction to f8, then also black gets into trouble after check, and then another check if king d8, then fork with knight f7, or after king f8, white is ready to checkmate with rook f7. And finally, the game ended with king captures knight, queen e3, king takes pawn, rook h3, and with similar checkmates as we've seen before. In fact, it's even faster here. Immediately queen g3. A very nice example on how to conclude an attack. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, black seems to be in a winning advantage, having a queen versus only a rook. However, if white plays accurately, white can save the game. Try to sit back, relax, and figure out how to save this seemingly hopeless position. The correct sequence is rook g3, very logical, forcing the king to the same rank as the black queen is on, and now we pin the queen. Well, this is not quite the end of the story. Black can block this attack with the bishop. And now comes the beautiful part. Rook takes bishop, queen takes, b3, forking the king and the queen, but either can capture. Well, that's very true, but as you can see, white is getting rid of all of his pieces, and the king is in stalemate, so only one piece left to get rid of, and white can successfully accomplish that by playing bishop e6. And after queen takes, it's stalemate. Pretty amazing. And if instead black captures the pawn in this position with the queen, then the pin comes from c2, again resulting stalemate. Well, hope you enjoyed this beautiful example, learned some ideas from the first 3 examples, and be back next week to learn some more chess knowledge. Take care until then.